So the Mishnah gave us a restriction when you're allowed to use the kira. If it's, and we said it only if it's shoveled out from its coals or the ashes were covered over. And the Gemara had a question, is that talking about only if you want to return pots to it on Shabbos, or even on if you want to leave pots there Erev Shabbos? The two terms are chazara, which means to return on Shabbos, or is it shehiyah, which means to wait from before Shabbos? So Tashma is going to be a proof that the Mishnah is even referring to Shehiyah, waiting before Shabbos, which means that it's more stricter. So Tashma, come and listen, mi diktani, since we learned Trei Bavi b'Masnisin. Trei Bavi means two clauses in our Mishnah. And the two clauses are two machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. The first one is, so we'll put a number 1 over here. Beis Shammai chamen avalei tavshel. Beis Hillel chamen v'tavshel. Beis Shammai say you can only put on the stove hot water but not a stew, and Beis Hillel says hot water and a stew. Beis Shammai noiten avalei machzir, and Beis Hillel af machzir. Beis Shammai say that you can take it off but you can't return, and Beis Hillel say you can even return. This is totally repetitious. That's exactly what we said over here, and it's just a quote from our Mishnah. So if this looks familiar, it is familiar. Okay, now the Gemara starts to explain, and it's going to explain why these two phrases, I should put in the number 2 over here, why these two machlokes, how is that a proof that the Mishnah is referring to waiting from before Shabbos? So I amrit bishleim alishes tnan, it is good, it fits well if the Mishnah is talking about waiting from before Shabbos. Hachik tani. So this is what the Mishnah is saying. Now we're going to reread the Mishnah with the words waiting before Shabbos in it. So kira shesikol b'kasha gvava, a 2-pot oven, which you see in that picture up there, that's lit up with kasha gvava, which is not relevant right here for our piece, but kasha gvava is straw. Mashanala, you're allowed to let weight on it, tavshel. Gefes veitzim, if you use marken wood, and this was what we were talking about, the restrictions. Lo yishad shigraf ed shitnes ha'efer. You're not allowed to let the food wait on the oven until you shovel it out, or until you put ashes over the coals. So the stress over here is that it says lo yisha instead of lo yitain, which means you're not allowed to let it wait. So we know that we're talking about before Shabbos. Well, that's the Gemara, but the Gemara didn't prove it yet. It's just, this is where the emphasis is. Now it says, Umahein Mashin, we're going to see the proof. What are you allowed to let wait on the stove? So the first machlokes is Beis Shammai, you're only allowed to let hot water wait, but not stew. So in other words, you can never have a hot cholent according to Beis Shammai on Shabbos. Beis Hillel say that you're allowed to even put hot food on the oven for Shabbos. Now, all of this is to let it wait from before Shabbos. It's the same way that they argue concerning waiting. They also argue about returning. That you're only allowed to that you're allowed to take off, but you're not allowed to return. So, of course, you're not allowed to return a stew, but because you were never allowed to even let a stew sit on the stove. But what about hot water, which you were allowed to let sit on the stove? So over here, Beis Shammai say that you're not allowed to put it back. Beis Hillel that you're allowed to put back whatever you're allowed to take off. You're allowed to put back. Okay, so all of this was explaining the two machlokes. The first one was talking about waiting from before Shabbos, and the second one was concerning what are you allowed to return or not. Okay, now let's try to complete the proof. But if you say that the Mishnah is talking about returning, so this is what it's saying. A 2-pot oven that was lit with straw, you're allowed to return a stew to it. If it's mark or wood, here it says you're not allowed to return to that oven until you shovel it out or until you cover the coals. And now the machlokes, the first machlokes, what are you allowed to return? So here, this is interesting. Beis Shammai says you're allowed to leave cholent on the fire, but you're not allowed to take it off and put it back on. The only thing you're allowed to put back on is hot water, avalei tavshel. But you can't put back on a stew. Beis Hillel say you can even put back a stew. Okay, now we've already completed the machlokes.